and I was one.
Year 1858 in Texas. 2 years before the American Civil War, a group of slaves chained together and barely able to lift their heads. Among them is Django Freeman, a man who has lost not just his freedom, but also his wife Broomhilda, after they were brutally separated at a slave auction. As the men march forward under the scorching sun, the quiet is shattered by the sound of approaching horses. A peculiar-looking wagon appears on the horizon, with a giant tooth bobbing up and down on a spring. The man riding the wagon is Dr. King Schultz, a German dentist turned bounty hunter, and he has no interest in the other slaves. He is here for Django. Schultz questions the slavers about Django, calmly explaining that he requires him for an important matter. But when the traders refuse to cooperate, Schultz wastes no time. He draws his revolver and shoots one of them point blank, leaving the others in shock. As the remaining traders panic, Schultz casually tosses Django the keys to his chains, offering him a chance at something he's never truly had before: freedom. He is no longer a slave, he is a free man. For the first time, he is a man with choices. But Schultz is not a savior. He is a businessman. And he needs Django's knowledge to identify 3 ruthless fugitives known as the Brittle Brothers, whom Schultz intends to kill for a bounty. As they ride through the vast, desolate landscape, Schultz teaches Django the ways of bounty hunting, explaining that the law allows men like them to kill criminals for a price, a system that, while brutal, is far more honest than slavery. Django, whose body has been beaten and broken by men like the Brittle Brothers, learns how to hold a gun, how to track a target, and most importantly, how to kill with precision. Their journey eventually brings them to a plantation owned by Big Daddy Bennett, where Django finally sees his opportunity for vengeance. With cold, steady hands, he tracks down Ellis Brittle, one of the men who once whipped his wife. Without hesitation, he raises his rifle, pulls the trigger, and watches as the man's body collapses into the dirt. The plantation erupts into chaos as Django and Schultz gun down the remaining Brittle brothers before escaping on horseback. Over the next few months, Django and Schultz ride across the snow-covered landscapes of the American frontier, hunting down fugitives and collecting rewards. With each kill, Django refines his skills, transforming from a former slave into a precise and deadly marksman. One evening, as they sit by the fire, Django reveals the story of how he and his wife attempted to escape together, only to be captured and branded with an R for runaway. He tells Schultz that Broomhilda was sold to a ruthless Mississippi plantation owner named Calvin Candie, a man infamous for forcing slaves to fight to the death in savage Mandingo fights. Schultz, moved by Django's unbreakable resolve, makes him a promise. They will find Broomhilda, and they will take her back. The journey through the dense southern landscape had led Django and Schultz to the gates of Candyland, a place where the rules of morality had long been abandoned in favor of greed, cruelty, and spectacle. Owned by Calvin Candie, a wealthy, charismatic, and sadistic slaver, the plantation was infamous for hosting Mandingo fights, brutal spectacles where enslaved men were forced to fight to the death for the entertainment of rich white men. Schultz and Django had carefully crafted a persona, arriving as wealthy investors supposedly looking to purchase the finest fighters. Stepping into Candie's grand estate, Schultz played the part of the well-mannered European businessman with ease, while Django, cloaked in the persona of a hardened, indifferent slave trader, kept his emotions locked behind a mask of cold detachment. But then, as Django stood amidst the wealth and decadence of the house, his eyes finally found her, Broomhilda. She did not recognize him at first, and yet in the flicker of her gaze, in the brief hesitation as she lowered her head, there was something unspoken. Schultz continued his elaborate ruse, speaking with the air of a scholar, all while laying the groundwork for their real plan. But lurking in the background, watching their every move, was Stephen, Candie's loyal house slave and the true enforcer of Candyland. Something about Django unsettled him. He observed the way the so-called slave trader carried himself, and then, when he saw Django glance at Broomhilda for just a moment too long, the pieces clicked into place. In a quiet but urgent whisper, Stephen informed Candie of what he had deduced. These men were not here for Mandingo fighters. They were here for her. Candie, no longer the jovial and accommodating host, transformed into something more menacing. He demanded $12,000 for Broomhilda's freedom, There was no choice. Schultz, his temper barely restrained, agreed to the deal. The papers were signed, the transaction completed, but Candie was not satisfied. Extending his hand to Schultz, he insisted on a handshake to finalize the deal, to force the German into a moment of degrading compliance. Schultz hesitated, his face betraying the quiet storm brewing inside him. And then, he reached into his sleeve, pulled out a small pistol, and shot Candie through the heart. Guns were drawn. Bullets tore through the air, and within seconds, Schultz was dead, shot before he could even reload. Django, outnumbered and cornered, fought back with everything he had, felling Candie's men with precise, brutal efficiency. But the numbers were against him. Before he could reload, he was struck, the force of the blow sending him crashing to the ground. He had been captured. Bound once more in chains, Django was dragged before Stephen, who now held the power Candie had once wielded. But Stephen had no intention of letting Django die easily. Instead, he sentenced him to something far worse than death, the LeQuint Dickey Mining Company, a labor camp where men were worked to death under the scorching sun. As Django was thrown into a cage and transported away, it seemed as though fate had once again stripped him of everything. But this time, Django was no longer just a slave. Django spun them a tale of hidden treasure, playing on their greed, feeding them a story just believable enough to lower their guard. When the moment came, he struck. In a heartbeat, he turned their weapons against them, killing every last one before setting their corpses ablaze. Dressed in their clothes, armed and prepared, he rode back to Candyland. Inside the mansion, Candie's men, still celebrating their supposed victory, were caught off guard as Django stepped through the grand doors. He moved through the house, his revolvers spitting fire, cutting down the men who had taken everything from him. Stephen, now wounded and crawling for safety, found himself face to face with the man he had sought to destroy. He begged, pleaded for his life, but Django did not waver. With slow, measured intent, he lit the fuse. As he walked out of the mansion, a deafening explosion consumed the estate, the fire lighting up the night sky. Outside, Broomhilda waited. She watched him approach, no longer a slave, no longer a prisoner, but a man who had rewritten his own fate.